Dr. Phil, what has your interest been in this case?
I do a lot of work with the Innocence Project from time to time, and I got involved in this case because they brought it to me, and it was of particular interest because this involves some real both technical and humanity aspects. This is a man that has been on death row for 21 years. He's autistic. And he has been convicted on science that has now been debunked by the medical community. He was convicted on shaken baby syndrome, and that has a triad of symptoms involved: subdural hematoma, brain swelling, and retinal hemorrhage. And the medical community has determined that that is simply is not a valid diagnosis for those symptoms, that they can be caused by a myriad of other things: improper medication, different types of pneumonia, just all sorts of things, that you can't use that to determine that someone has abused a child.
You were able to visit Mr. Roberson in prison. Were you able to conduct any type of exams on him, or what your evaluation would be?
Well, what I've done in this case, and thanks for asking that, because it's a valid question. I don't get involved in every case that's brought to me, and there are a number of cases that are brought to me by different chapters of the Innocence Project, and some I can't get comfortable with, and others I can. And I go through a variety of things before I can get behind a case. And one is I have to examine the facts of the case. And oftentimes that involves the police reports, the investigative aspect of what's gone on leading up to the charges. And then I get the trial record. And in this case, for example, I read the trial record, the transcripts from the trial, from the first word to the last word. I studied the jury charge, and I spent a lot of my career in the litigation arena, so I'm very familiar with all of that. And then I looked at all of the evidence that came in terms of the medical testimony of what was alleged for this individual. And then I went to death row and sat down with Robert Roberson and asked him a lot of hard questions. And I've spent a lot of my career involved in deception detection and interrogation techniques. And I grilled him pretty hard. And I have to tell you this: in a circumstantial case like this, we don't know what happened behind closed doors between this father and this child. I can tell you an opinion, but what I do know from looking at the records is this man has not been afforded due process, and he has not gotten a fair trial. And, if we're going to deprive someone of their liberty in America, it comes at a very high standard. If we're going to deprive someone of their life in this country, it comes at the ultimate high standard. And that simply has not been met in this case. This man has not been afforded due process. He has certainly not had a fair trial, and he was convicted on science that has been completely debunked and rejected by the medical community. So it doesn't pass what's called the Daubert test, junk science test. So he was convicted on science that has been rejected. He did not get due process, and the trial record shows that he didn't even have a lawyer that advocated for him in this case.
Dr. Phil, could you explain how his autism would have complicated the investigation at the time?
I'm so glad you asked, because, autism is on a spectrum. That's why we call it a spectrum disorder. And it's not monolithic. It's different for so many people. But one thing we know is that it's not uncommon for autistic individuals to have a difficult time relating socially with others. They don't interact with as much comfort. They don't, show emotion the same way others do. They don't interact socially. And when he showed up at the hospital with this 2-year-old child, they noticed that he wasn't showing what you would expect a distressed parent to show. He wasn't showing the emotions, the concern, the expressions that you would expect from a parent who had a child, that was blue, that was having trouble breathing. And they quite rightly saw that as a red flag, and they quite rightly called for help and investigation. I have no problem with that. I'd rather investigate 99 false cases than fail to investigate one that, in fact, did involve abuse. What I object to is that once that determination was made, it just trickled down through the investigation process. They got what I call triad tunnel vision. They saw those three things and said, wow, everything else fell by the wayside. They didn't look at her medical history. This child had presented with respiratory distress a number of times in her short life when he wasn't even in her life. She had lung scans that showed that she had interstitial pneumonia and difficult time breathing. She had been given medications that had black box warnings against giving them to a child her age. She had to be resuscitated 2 or 3 times when he wasn't in her life at all. And they did not wait to see those scans and gather that information before he was arrested, charged, put in front of a grand jury. And the medical examiner admitted that she did not look at lung scans, brain scans, or anything else. They just decided this was a shaken baby case. And off he went to jail and wound up on death row. And none of this has been 21 years this man has sat on death row without people considering an alternative explanation for why this child tragically died, when in fact she was both acutely and chronically ill and was given medication that works to shut down the respiratory system.
Dr. Phil, it's my understanding that some jurors said that once they heard shaken baby syndrome, that they couldn't focus on anything else, that they were done. They had convicted him.
That's correct. And I met one of the jurors today in Texas who listened to my testimony and was very distraught and saying, we didn't know any of this. We never heard any of these alternative explanations. We didn't know she had pneumonia. We didn't know she had been to the doctor and or hospital 46 times in 23 months of life. We didn't know she had to be resuscitated 2 or 3 times when he was not in her life. We knew none of that. They didn't present any of that to us at all. Never heard a word of it.
I always say that the lens of time can be very telling. How do you think things would have been different if this case had been tried under current standards and understandings?
I don't believe that he would have ever been charged, because I think the determination would have been there was no crime committed here by anyone. I think they would have said this was a very ill child and that it's tragic, but nobody did anything wrong here. There was no crime of abuse against this child, and there was no negligence on the part of the father or anyone else concerning this child. And, it's terrible when a child loses their life in this way, but this child was ill from birth. And as I say, 46 visits in 23 months and had to be resuscitated more than once. So I think he showed up and didn't know how to express himself, and then had a public defender. I stopped counting at 47 in the trial record with shaken baby syndrome being mentioned, and his own lawyer said clearly this is a case of shaken baby. And he was offered plea bargains a number of times leading up to trial, and he never took a single one because he said, look, I didn't do anything wrong here. And, he's not particularly intellectual. He's has some developmental issues, and he's not cognitively agile, but I think he knows right from wrong. And he hasn't had a perfect past. He had some criminal problems in his past, but they were not violent crimes. He never attacked anyone. It was no assault charges, anything like that. And he just, I think, got railroaded in this situation. And look, I know a lot of public defenders that are passionate and really hardworking and do a good job, but they're way overworked. And I just don't think he had adequate representation here. And I don't think he was particularly adept at assisting in his own defense.
Dr. Phil, as a Texan, perhaps you could explain to us how this case has created almost like a tug of war between those who are like saying, absolutely, he must be put to death, enough with the conversation about what happened, and those who are saying, wait, we need another minute.
Well, thanks for asking about that, because there are 101 and counting legislators that have signed a petition to save this man's life. And I believe at least half of them are pro-death penalty folks. But they say, look, we support the death penalty here, but we need to get it right. And while we support the death penalty, we absolutely don't think this man has had the proper the proper opportunity to have the case heard. All of the evidence has not been presented to a jury. And I'm honest to say, I think the jury got it right in finding him guilty and recommending the death penalty based on what they heard, not on all the facts. I think juries tend to get it right. And I think this jury got it right based on what they heard. The problem is they didn't hear the whole story. They didn't hear all of the things that the medical examiner overlooked. They didn't hear about her chronic illness, and they certainly didn't know that shaken baby has been debunked as an explanation for this triad of symptoms. I think if they heard everything, they would have returned a not guilty verdict, and he wouldn't be on death row today.
Dr. Phil, is there anything you want to add before we go?
Just simply that I believe this man needs an evidentiary hearing at an absolute minimum, and he needs a new trial. And I think he's entitled to it. He has sat on death row for 21 years. And I think if he is retried with current science and a full vetting of all the facts of this case, I think he will be found not guilty. And I think this is a terrible miscarriage of justice. And as I say, in America, if we're going to deprive somebody of their life, we need to get it right. And there have been a number of exonerations on shaken baby because of this very fact. And I think this will be the next exoneration on shaken baby, where somebody says there was no crime committed here. Nobody did anything. And these exonerations are always days to celebrate, but exonerations across the board, not just shaken baby. People have served over 5,000 years collectively on death row for crimes they didn't commit that were later exonerated by DNA or other things. And so it's not a perfect system. We don't always get it right, and we need to have the courage to step up and admit it when we get it wrong.
Thank you, sir.